Bedtime is supposed to be a happy event for a tired child. For me, it was terrifying. While some children might complain about being put to bed before they have finished watching a movie or playing their favorite video game, when I was a child, nighttime was truly something to fear. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it still is. As someone who trained in the sciences, I cannot prove that what happened to me was objectively real, but I can swear that what I experienced was genuine horror, a fear in which my life, I'm glad to say, has never been equaled. I will relate to you now as best I can. Make of it what you will, but I'm glad to get it off my chest. I can't remember exactly when it started, but my apprehension towards falling asleep seemed to correspond with my being moved into a room of my own. I was 8 years old at the time, and until then, I had shared a room quite happily with my older brother. As is perfectly understandable for a boy 5 years my senior, my brother eventually wished for a room of his own, and as a result, I was given the room at the back of the house. It was small, narrow, yet oddly elongated room, large enough for a bed and a couple of chests of drawers and not much else. I couldn't really complain, because even at that age I understood that we didn't have a large house, and I had no real cause to be disappointed, as my family was both loving and caring. It was a happy childhood, during the day. A solitary window looked out into our back garden, nothing out of the ordinary. But even during the day, the light crept into that room. It seemed almost hesitant to do so. As my brother was given a new bed, I was given the bunk bed air beds that we used to share. While I was upset about sleeping on my own, I was excited at the thought of being able to sleep on the top bunk, which seemed far more adventurous to me. From the very first night, I remember feeling something strange, a feeling of unease creeping slowly from the back of my mind. I lay on the top bunk, staring down at my action figures and cars strewn throughout the green-blue carpet, as imaginary battles and adventures took place between the toys on the floor, and I couldn't help but feel that my eyes were being slowly drawn towards the bottom bunk, as if something was moving in the corner of my eye, something which did not wish to be seen. The bunk was empty, impeccably made with a dark blue blanket tucked in neatly, partially covering the two bland white pillows. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was a child, and the noise slipping under my door from my parents' television bathed me in a warm sense of safety and well-being. So, I fell asleep. When you awaken from a deep sleep to something moving or stirring, it can take a few moments for you to truly understand what is happening. The fog of sleep hangs over your eyes. Something was moving. There was no doubt about that. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Everything was dark, almost pitch black. But there was enough light creeping in from the outside to outline that narrowly suffocating room. Two thoughts appeared in my mind almost simultaneously. The first was that my parents were in bed, because the rest of the house lay in darkness and silence. The second thought turned to the noise, a noise which had obviously woken. As the last of the cobwebs' sleep withered from my mind, the noise took on a more familiar form. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. A cold wind whistled through the trees outside. A neighbor's footsteps, uncomfortably close, or in this case, the simple sound of a bedsheet rustling in the dark. That was it. Bedsheets rustling in the dark, as if I had disturbed some sleeper who was attempting to get it all too comfortable in the bottom bunk. I lay there in disbelief, thinking that the noise was either my imagination, perhaps my pet cat finding somewhere comfortable to spend the night. It was then that I noticed my door, shut as it had been as I had fallen asleep. Perhaps my mom was checking in on me, and the cat had snuck into my room then. Yes, that must have been it. I turned to face the wall, closing my eyes in vain. As I moved, the rustling noise from underneath me ceased. I thought that I must have disturbed my cat. But quickly I realized that the visitor in the bottom bunk was much less mundane than a pet trying to sleep, and much more sinister. As if alerted to and gruntled by my presence, the disturbed sleeper began to toss and turn violently, like a child having a tantrum in their bed. I could hear the sheets twist and turn with increasing ferocity. Fear then gripped me. Not like the subtle sense of unease I had experienced earlier, but now potent and terrifying. My heart raced as my eyes panicked, scanning the almost impenetrable darkness. I let out a cry. As most young boys do, I instinctively shouted on my mother. I could hear something stir on the other side of the house, but as I began to breathe a sigh of relief that my parents were coming, to save me, the bunk bed started to shake violently, as if gripped by an earthquake, scraping against the wall. I could hear the sheets below me now thrashing, as if tormented by malice. I did not want to jump down to safety, as I feared the thing on the bottom bunk would reach out and grab me, pulling me into the darkness. So I stayed there, white knuckles clenching my own blanket like a shroud of protection. The wait seemed like an eternity. The door finally and thankfully burst open, and I lay bathed in light while the bottom bunk, the resting place of my unwanted visitor, lay empty and peaceful. I cried, and my mother consoled me. Tears of fear, aloud, followed by relief, streamed down my face. And yet, through all the horror and relief, I did not tell her why I was upset. I couldn't explain it. But it was as though whatever had been in that bunk would return, if even so much as I spoke it out loud, or uttered a single syllable of its existence. Whether that was the truth, I do not know. But as a child, I felt as though that unseen malice remained close, listening. My mother lay in the empty bunk, promising to stay there until morning. Eventually, my anxiety diminished, tiredness pushed me back to sleep, but I remained restless, waking several times momentarily to the sound of rustling bedsheets. I remember the next day wanting to go anywhere, be anywhere, but in that narrow, suffocating room. It was a Saturday, and I played outside, quite happily with my friends. Although our house was not large, we were lucky enough to have a long, sloping garden in the back. We played there often, as much of it was overgrown and we could hide in the bushes, climb in the huge sycamore tree, which towered above all else, and easily imagine ourselves in the throes of a grand adventure in some untamed exotic land. As fun as it all was, occasionally my eye would turn to that small window, ordinary, slight, and innocuous. But for me, that thin boundary was a looking glass into a strange, cold pocket of dread. Outside, the lush green surroundings of our garden, filled with the smiling faces of my friends, could not extinguish the creeping feeling clawing its way up my spine, each hair standing on end. The feeling of something in that room, watching me play, waited for the night when I would be alone, eagerly filled with hate. It may sound strange to you, but by the time my parents ushered me back into that room for the night, I said nothing. I didn't protest. I didn't even make an excuse as to why I couldn't sleep there. I simply and sullenly walked into that room, climbed the few steps into the top bunk, and then waited. As an adult, I would be telling everyone about my experience. But even at that age, I felt almost silly to be talking about something which I had really no evidence for. I would be lying, however, if I said this was my primary reason. I still felt that this thing would be enraged as if I so much as spoke of it. It's funny how certain words can remain hidden from your mind, no matter how blatant or obvious they are. One word came to me that second night, lying there in the darkness alone, frightened, aware of a rotten change in the atmosphere, a thickening of the air as if something had displaced it. As I heard the first casual twists of the bed sheets below, the first anxious increase of my heartbeat, at the realization that something was once again in the bottom bunk, that word, a word that had been sent to exile, filtered up through my consciousness, breaking free of all repression, gasping for air, screaming, etching and carving itself into my mind. Ghost. As this thought came to me, I noticed that my unwelcome visitor had ceased moving. The bed sheets lay calm and dormant, but they had been replaced with something far more hideous. A slow, rhythmic, rasping breath heaved and escaped from the thing below. I could imagine its chest rising and falling with each sordid, wheezing and garbled breath. I shuddered and hoped beyond all hope that it would leave without occurrence. The house lay as it had the previous night, in a thick blanket of darkness. Silence prevailed, all but for the perverted breath of my, as yet, unseen bunker. I lay there terrified. I just wanted this thing to go, to leave me alone. What did it want? Then, something unmistakably chilling transpired. It fucking moved. It moved in a way different from before. When it threw itself around to the bottom bunk, it seemed unrestrained, without purpose, almost animalistic. This movement, however, was driven by awareness, with purpose, a goal in mind. For that thing lying there in the darkness, that thing which seemed intent on terrorizing a young boy, calmly and nonchalantly sat up. Its labored breath had become louder, as now only a mattress and a few flimsy wood slats separated my body from the unearthly breath below. I lay there, my eyes filled with tears, a fear which mere words cannot relate to you or anyone else coursed through my veins. I would not have believed that this fear could have been more heightened, but I was so wrong. I imagined what this thing would have looked like, sitting there listening from my mattress, hoping to catch the slightest hint that I was awake. Imagination then turned into an unnerving reality. It began to touch the wooden slats which my mattress sat on. It seemed to caress them carefully, running what I imagined to be fingers and hands along the surface of the wood. Then, with great force, it prodded angrily between the two slats into the mattress, even through the padding. It felt as though somebody had viciously stuck their fingers into my side. I let out an almighty cry, and the wheezing, shaking, and moving of the thing in the bunk below replied in kind by violently vibrating the bunk as it had done the night before. Small flakes of paint powdered onto my blanket from the wall as the frame of the bed scraped along it, backwards and forwards. Once again, I was bathed in light, and there stood my mother, loving, caring as she always was, with a comforting hug and calming word which eventually subdued my hysteria. Of course, she asked what was wrong, but I could not say. I dared not say. I simply said one word over and over again. Nightmare. Nightmare. It was a nightmare. This pattern of events continued for weeks, if not months. Night after night, I would awaken to the sound of rustling sheets. Each time I would scream, so as to not provoke this abomination, with the time to prod and feel for me. With each cry, the bed would shake violently, stopping with the arrival of my mother, who had spent the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, seemingly unaware of the sinister force torturing her son. Along the way, I managed to feign illness a few times, and come up with less than truthful reasons for my sleeping in my parents' bed. But more often than not, I would be alone for the first few hours of each night at the place. The room where the light from outside did not sit right. alone with that thing. With time, you can become desensitized to almost anything, no matter how horrific. I had come to realize that, for whatever reason, that this thing could not harm me when my mother was present. I am sure that the same would have been said for my father, but as loving as he was, waking him from sleep was almost impossible. After a few months, I had grown accustomed to my nightly visitor. Do not mistake this for some unearthly friendship. I detested this thing. I still feared it greatly, as I could almost sense its desires and personality, if you could call it that. One filled with a perverted and twisted hatred, yet longing for me, of perhaps all things. My greatest fears were realized in the winter. The days grew short, and the longer nights merely provided this wretch with more opportunities. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother, a wonderfully kind and gentle woman, had deteriorated greatly since the death of my grandfather. My mother was trying her best to keep her in the community as long as possible. However, dementia is a cruel and degenerative illness, robbing a person of their memories, one day at a time. Soon she recognized none of us. It became clear that she would need to be moved from her house to a nursing. Before she could be moved, my grandmother had a particularly difficult few nights, and my mother decided that she would stay with her. As much as I loved my grandmother and felt nothing but anguish at her illness, to this day I feel guilty that my first thoughts were not of her, but of what my nightly visitor may do should have become aware of my mother's absence. Her presence was the one thing which I was sure was protecting me from the full horror of this thing's reach. I rushed home from school that day and immediately wrenched the bedsheets and mattress from the lower bunk, removing all the slats and placing an old desk, a chest of drawers, and some chairs which we kept in a cupboard where the bottom bunk used to be. I told my father that I was making an office, which he found adorable, but I would be damned if I would give this thing a place to sleep for one more night. As darkness approached, I lay there knowing my mother was not in the house. I did not know what to do. My only impulse was to sneak into her jewelry box and take a small family crucifix, which I had seen before. While my family was not very religious, at the age I still believed in God and hoped that somehow this would protect me. Although fearful and anxious, while gripping the crucifix under my pillow tightly in one hand, sleep eventually came as I drifted off to dream, hoping that I would awaken in the morning without incident. Unfortunately, that night was the most terrifying of all. I woke gradually. The room was once again dark, as my eyes adjusted, and I could gradually make out the window and door, and the walls, some of the toys on the shelf, and even to this day, I shudder to think it. No rustling of sheets, no movement at all. The room felt lifeless, yet not empty. The nightly visitor, that unwelcome, wheezing, hate-filled thing which had terrorized me night after night, was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Utter terror had shaken me from the sound of my voice. I lay motionless. If I could not scream, I didn't want to let it know that I was awake. I had not seen it yet. I could only feel it. It was obscured under my blanket, but I could sense its outline, and I could feel its presence, but I dared not look. The weight of it pressed down on top of me, a sensation that I'll never forget. When I say that hours passed, I did not exaggerate. Laying there motionless in the darkness, I was every bit scared and frightened. If it had been the summer months, it would have been light by then, but the grasp of winter is long and unrelenting, and I knew that it would be hours before sunrise, a sunrise which I yearned for. I was a timid child by nature, but I reached a breaking point, a moment where I could no longer wait anymore, where I could survive under this intimately deviant abomination no longer. Fear can sometimes wear you out, make you threadbare, and a shell of nerves, leaving the only slightest trace of you behind. I had to get out of this bed. Then I remember the crucifix. My hand still lay underneath the pillow, but it was empty. I slowly moved my wrist around to find it, minimalizing as best as I could the sound and vibrations caused, but it could not be found. I had to have either knocked it off the top bunk or it had... I couldn't bear to think of it. Been taken from my hand. Without the crucifix, I lost any sense of hope. Even at such a young age, you can be acutely aware of what death is and intensely frightened of it. I knew that I was going to die in that bed if I lay there dormant, passive, doing nothing. I had to leave the room behind. But how? Should I leap from the bed and hope that I make it to the door? What if it's faster than me? Or should I slowly slip out of the top bunk, hoping not to disturb my uncanny bedfellow? Realizing that it had not stirred when I moved, trying to find the crucifix, I began to have the strangest of thoughts. What if it was asleep? It hadn't so much as breathed since I woken up. Perhaps it was resting, believing that it had finally got... that I was finally in its grasp. Or perhaps it was toying. After all, it had been doing so for countless nights, and now with me under it, pinned against my mattress with no mother to protect me. Maybe it was holding off, savoring its victory into the last possible moment, like a wild animal savoring its prey. I tried to breathe as shallowly as possible, and mustering every ounce of courage I could, I reached over slowly with my right hand and began to peel the blanket off of me. What I found under those covers almost stopped my own. I did not see it, but as my hand moved the blanket, it brushed against something smooth and cold, which felt unmistakably like a gaunt hand. I held my breath in terror, as I was sure that it must have known I was awake. It did not stir. It felt dead. After a few moments, I placed my hand carefully further down the blanket and felt a thin, poorly formed form. My confidence, an almost twisted sense of curiosity, grew as I moved further down to a disproportionately larger bicep muscle. The arm was outstretched, lying across my chest, with the hand resting above my left shoulder, as if it had grabbed me in my sleep. I realized that I would have had to move this cadaverous appendage if I even so much as hoped to escape its grip. For some reason, the feeling of torn, ragged clothing on the shoulder of this nightmare invader stopped me in my tracks. Fear once again swelled in my stomach and my chest as I recoiled my hand in disgust and the touch of scraggly oil hair. I could not bring myself to touch its face, although I wondered to this very day what it would have felt like. Oh dear God, it just moved. It moved. It was subtle, but its grip on my shoulder, across my body, tightened. No tears came, but God, how I wanted to cry. Its hand and arm slowly coiled around me. My right leg brushed again along the cool wall which the bed lay against. Of all that happened to me in that room, this was the strangest. I realized that this clutching, rancid thing, which drew delight from violating a young boy's bed, was not entirely on top of me. It was sticking out from the wall, like a spider striking from its lair. Suddenly its grip moved from a slowly tightening to a sudden squeeze. It pulled and clawed at my clothes as if frightened at the opportunity that would soon pass. I fought against it, but its emaciated arm was too strong for me. Its head rose up, writhing and contorting from under the blanket. I now realized where it was taking me. Into the fucking walls. I fought for my dear life. I cried, and suddenly my voice returned to me. Yelling, screaming, but nobody came. I then realized why it was so eager to suddenly strike. Why this thing had me now. Why it had to have me. Through my window, the window seemed to represent so much malice from the outside, streaked hope, the first rays of sunshine. I struggled further, knowing that I could just hold on,
and soon it would be gone. I feared for my life, and the unearthly parasite shifted, slowly pulling itself up to my chest, its head now poking from under the blanket, wheezing, coughing, rasping. I do not remember its features, but I slowly remembered its breath against my face, foul and cold as ice. As the sun broke over the horizon, the dark place, that suffocating room of contempt, was bathed and washed in sunlight. I passed out as its scrawny fingers encircled my neck, squeezing the very life from me. I awoke to my father offering to make me some breakfast. A wonderful sight indeed. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life until then. I moved the bed away from the wall, leaving behind the furniture I believed that would stop the thing from taking a bed. Little did I know that it would try to take mine and me. Weeks passed without incident, yet on one cold, frostbitten. I awoke to the sounds of the furniture where the bunk beds used to be, vibrating fine. In a moment, it passed. I lay there, sure that I could hear a distant wheezing coming from deep within the wall, finally fading into the distance. I had never told anyone this story before. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of sheets rustling in the night, or a breeze, or a wheeze, rustled on. I had never told anyone this story before. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bed sheets rustling in the night, or a wheeze brought on by a common cold. And I certainly could never sleep with my bed against a wall. Call it superstition if you will, but as I said, I cannot discount conventional explanations as to such as sleep paralysis, hallucinations, or an overactive imagination. But what I can say is this. The following year, I was given a larger room at the other side of the house, and my parents took that strangely suffocating, elongated place as their bedroom. They said that they didn't need a large room, just one big enough for a bed and a few things. They lasted 10 days. We moved on the 11th.